Hi, everybody. Happy Friday. So, I went back and checked the syllabus, and we are actually on track. I thought we were starting to get a little behind, but looks like we're actually on track, so that's good. I think today we'll finish up the content on schizophrenia. I posted some slides that are about the diagnoses for the mood disorders. It's not all of the slides that we'll get into, but if we have time, we'll kind of start on that today. And then next week, we're going to start our article presentation. So on Monday, Izzy's going to present the paper that's been posted, and then I will post the one for Finn. He sent it to me, and I just realized that I hadn't put it on my courses yet. And so his presentation is going to be on Wednesday. Correct? Yep. Okay. And that was bipolar. And then we'll work our way through some of the mood disorder content. Probably we will get a little behind at that point because we're not meeting on Friday next week, right? So 1 week from today, no class. In lieu of that, you guys are meeting with me individually. Some of you have already met with. Most of you are signed up. If you haven't signed up yet, please do that. And then, of course, this weekend is the first reaction paper. So good job getting your article approved. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you think about the studies that you selected. And then once you are able to get that in, start thinking about the next one. Okay? Also a topic from Unit 2. Same thing. But once you get that first one under your belt, hopefully it'll be easier to do the second one. So first, does anybody have any questions about the reaction paper that's due? Everybody feels okay? Okay, it's a couple pages, double spaced, so it shouldn't be too bad. Just try to make sure you're as thorough as possible in addressing the items or the questions by having the instructions, okay? Okay, so, one other thing I wanted to mention, and I mentioned this to a couple people when I met with them. When it comes to your research proposal, the next assignment that's due is later in the semester, and that's actually your annotated outline. And so, the difference between what you submitted so far and that is pretty big. You're going to, meet with me and we'll talk about your idea to help hone it down. But because you all have already taken most of the research methods courses, there's kind of an expectation that you kind of know how to write an introduction, right? But those can often be the hardest part to write. And so if at some point in between those times you would like to meet with me again or send me something to look at, like if you have started drafting the outline or anything like that, I'm happy to do that. I just didn't want to give you all more required assignments, but I also want to make sure that if you need some feedback while you're putting the outline or the initial draft together, just reach out to me. All right, so one thing I'm going to do is go back a little bit and talk about the corollary discharge theory again, because there were a couple of questions on that. And so, in schizophrenia, as you know, oftentimes one of the positive symptoms are usually auditory or visual hallucinations, although you could have others. And so one of the theories to explain that is this corollary discharge. So corollary usually means something that's happening alongside, okay? And so, in this case, when it comes to incoming stimuli, our brains are already designed to take into account whether we're producing those stimuli ourselves. So, for example, when we talk, we can obviously, at least most people can hear themselves talk, right? But even people who don't have the capacity to hear, they can usually feel if they touch themselves, as opposed to when someone else taps them on the arm. And so, one of the theories, particularly for the auditory hallucination schizophrenia, is this idea that the built-in system we have to be able to distinguish between our own voice or our own touch and something that's coming from another source external to us is not functioning properly. Okay? And so what's happening is, in someone without schizophrenia, you have this buffer system, which is in the blue here, that's allowing us to distinguish between the auditory information that you're hearing and whether it's something that you're producing. So in this diagram, little green circle there is kind of like Broca's area, which is responsible for producing speech, right? And so signals are sent that are telling our brain that's our voice. And you're able to then distinguish it and know that it's not someone else talking to you. In those with schizophrenia, it seems as though that system is not working properly, that buffer is not working properly. And so it's possible they maybe have speech generated in Broca's area that they then are interpreting as not coming from themselves. So they don't even necessarily have to say it out loud because we've got the speech programs there, if that makes sense. And so really what this theory gets down to is there's a difference in terms of being able to distinguish whether we're producing that particular stimulus versus it being produced external to us. That doesn't necessarily explain all the symptoms we see, and it's not like 100% explains the hallucinations, but that's the general gist of it. Okay, and one of the theories from a neuroanatomical perspective is that maybe this inefficiency, right, where this buffer doesn't work properly, is due to abnormalities in myelization that connects the frontal lobes to other areas. Does that help? Okay. Okay. So we left off last time talking about treatments for schizophrenia, and I mentioned some of the older treatments and how antipsychotic medication, once it was developed, kind of revolutionized treatment for this disorder. And so the earliest antipsychotic medication that was developed is chlorpromazine. Another one that is similar is haloperidol. And these essentially are antagonists for dopamine. And so they're reducing that dopamine overactivity that we talked about last time. And so they're pretty effective for reducing the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, but they don't do much for the negative symptoms. In addition, a proportion, almost a third of patients who take these typical, or sometimes they're called first generation antipsychotic medications, develop a stereotyped motor movement that we call tardive dyskinesia. So the term kinesia means movement, and this usually means impaired or dysfunction, right, or abnormality. And so in this case, it often manifests as sort of writhing movements in the mouth. Sometimes it can be in the hands. And so it's a side effect of this constant blockade of dopamine. And so some people don't like this because it does give people kind of an odd appearance in social settings, right? Because it's particularly noticeable. So a little bit later, some people, pharmaceutical researchers, developed the second generation of antipsychotic meds, which are also called atypical antipsychotics. And these are things like clozapine or risperidone. And they also work as an antagonist on the dopamine system. Most of them also affect serotonin as well, so attenuating serotonin activity. While the typical antipsychotics really are designed to block the T2 dopamine receptors in particular, you have less of that typical, so they may also provide blockage of the other dopamine receptors. And one of the main reasons these were developed were to help prevent some of the side effects that we saw with the typical antipsychotics. Now, since then, there have been many more of these antipsychotic medications developed. There are quite a few of them. And for the most part, I think over time, the creation of newer versions has primarily been targeted to help reduce any of the negative potential side effects that we see. Because individuals that are taking these medications are usually on them for life. so when it comes to non-pharmacological treatments, so there are some people who would say, well, those with schizophrenia probably just need medication. It's a largely biological condition. But if any of you have ever worked with anyone or know anyone with schizophrenia, then you know that there are a lot of aspects of the disorder that impact the person's ability to function in their daily life, right? So when we talked about the different kinds of symptoms before, which symptoms did I say were the ones that really affect their function? The cognitive ones, right? And that also is related to social interactions as well. And so medications, the atypical ones, can help with that to some extent, right? It helps improve both the positive and the negative symptoms, and the cognitive ones a little bit. But there are other strategies that can complement the medication to help really target increasing their skills in certain areas to overcome those cognitive and social deficits. You see? So there are just different forms of psychosocial rehabilitation. So focused on helping them recognize social cues and how to sort of react to them appropriately. Because social interactions are a key area that make things like holding down a job difficult for the individual at times. And then another area that's gotten a lot of attention lately is cognitive retraining for schizophrenia, or sometimes it's called cognitive remediation. And so part of the argument for this is that the cognitive deficits that you see in schizophrenia, they tend to show up early. So again, you remember we talked about some of those abnormalities that you can go back retrospectively and you look, you can notice that the person exhibits sort of some atypical behaviors. That includes sometimes cognitive deficits. And even when somebody is treated appropriately with medication that's reducing their positive symptoms and maybe their negative, you don't see large improvements in the cognitive deficits on these medications. And so even when somebody is presumably in what we might call a remission period, where they're not actively experiencing positive symptoms, the cognitive symptoms are still impairing their ability to function. And in fact, there have been studies that have shown that the cognitive deficit that one experiences as part of their overall diagnosis or experience with schizophrenia are really strongly predictive of their functional outcomes, right? Quality of life, satisfaction, relationship, being able to maintain a job. So those, like I said, those are tightly correlated with the cognitive symptoms. In addition, the cognitive symptoms can influence somebody's ability to really maintain and adhere to their medication regimen. So oftentimes, people are on more than one medication, and not to mention they could have other health conditions that they have to take medications for. And so if you have cognitive impairments that involve deficits in frontal lobe functioning, it's really hard to keep your schedule straight, right, and keep everything in order. And so cognitive retraining is thought to be able to help with that. And so basically what cognitive retraining means is you're training your brain kind of like when you go to the gym and you train your muscles, right? So people come in and they engage in a set of exercises that are designed to strengthen attention, strengthen memory skills. It's like practicing, right? They practice their executive functioning skills through different exercises and tasks. And over time, ideally, this is going to kind of strengthen those skills, kind of like strengthening your muscle. And so neither of these are typically used in isolation as a treatment for schizophrenia, but rather may be adjuncts or additions to medication. Now, sometimes you will also see different types of psychotherapy. If someone has other, particularly if they have other psychiatric concerns, like coping with depression, anxiety, on top of schizophrenia. So they might see CBT approaches used as well. Okay, so the next disorder in the psychotic disorders category that I briefly want to talk about is that delusional disorder, because it is new in the DSM-5. So the main criterion for this is just the presence of one or more delusions for at least a month or longer. The person does not have to meet criterion A for schizophrenia, right? So in fact, they can't meet it. Because if criterion A, if you recall, was that they experience 2 or more of the symptoms. I was just trying to think if there's a fast way for me to go back and show you that. But obviously, if they meet criteria for schizophrenia, then they would get diagnosed with schizophrenia over delusional disorder. Right, so it's 2 or more of the symptoms that were in the list of delusions and hallucinations, disorganized speech, disorganized behavior, and negative symptoms. So, this one is specific to delusions, and they shouldn't exhibit any of the other schizophrenia criteria. Now, what's also interesting about this is when the person is not experiencing the delusion, so in between their delusion states, they have no impairments in their function. So, on average, when you were to interact with this person, they would be able to function just fine, maintain school, maintain work, relationships. However, when they do experience delusion, that's when you see, obviously, it's impacting their ability to function. Now, if you look at the literature on delusional disorder, you'll see a lot of research talking about this in relation to other conditions like dementia. So, as people get older, we'll talk about towards the end of the semester the effects that can have on the brain. And so, when you see the signs of cognitive impairment that are associated with aging, then sometimes that can produce delusions, and then it might actually be qualifying for this diagnosis. They do tend to, in the DSM, they look at subtypes, they categorize the types of delusions. So, erotomanic, grandiose, jealous, persecutory, and somatic. So, again, depending on what the actual delusion is, like a grandiose delusion is when they believe that they are someone, incredibly important in the world, or persecutory, of course, is that they believe that they're people out to get them. And keep in mind that these have to be things that are not feasible, right? If somebody worked their entire career as a CIA agent, and they did have people that were out to get them during their lifetime, then, that has to be taken into account. Maybe it's not a delusion. In terms of what we know about biological function related specifically to delusional disorder, you see a lot of the same patterns of abnormalities that you see in schizophrenia, right? Especially lower volume and lower activity in the prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, so that hypofrontality that we talked about. Now, there have been a few studies that looked at specific subtypes. So, for example, those who have delusional disorder but not schizophrenia, that is more paranoid or persecutory, show overactivity in the amygdala, which we would expect for someone who is experiencing fear and threats. One thing that I don't think is on here I want to mention too is that there is some research that suggests lower volume in the pituitary gland in delusional disorder. You also see that in other disorders where there are sort of abnormal beliefs, like OCD, where they have obsessions that we would consider a little out of the ordinary, or even people who have, I'm trying to think what they call it now, maybe it's a 5. It's essentially hypochondriasis, form of anxiety disorder about your health. So they sort of have magnified concerns about maybe like health anxiety, I forget. So anyway, I just wanted to point out that there does seem to be something related to the endocrine system, because that's what the pituitary is in charge of, right? Related to the experiencing of these abnormal beliefs. So there must be something related to hormone levels that's influencing other areas of the brain. Sorry. Okay, so the treatment for delusional disorder is very similar to other psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, so antipsychotic medications. One of the notes I have is that this disorder sometimes can be resistant to treatment, particularly if it is related to something like cognitive decline you see in dementia. And that's probably because maybe there's a larger set of issues going on. So it is kind of a hard area to, hard disorder to treat. Okay, so the last diagnosis, bless you, that I want to talk about in the psychotic disorder category is schizotypal personality disorder. So again, this is, bless you, everybody's allergic to being in class today. So this is a personality disorder. And so again, in the older versions of DSM, we used to separate personality disorders out when we had that multi-axial system, because we believed that they were more a pervasive part of who the person was, as opposed to most of the other disorders we talk about. We don't separate them out anymore, but you will see in terms of the way the symptoms are described, it is this idea that it's a part of the person's personality, it's a part of their typical behavioral and cognitive style, as opposed to experiencing symptoms for a period of time and then having periods where they aren't experiencing these. Okay, so for example, those with major depression might experience symptoms, but it often doesn't last for a long time. That would be with a different diagnostic category. Whereas these are sort of part of who the person is, right? So by that nature, it makes personality disorders in general difficult to treat. But again, the thing I guess I'm trying to emphasize here is that it's more like a long-term pattern as opposed to things that tend to happen in more smaller, quantifiable incidents, so episodes. Okay, so with schizotypal, so this is when the person is exhibiting behaviors, so for the diagnosis of 5 or more, that look a lot like some of the things that you see in schizophrenia, right? So things like, delusional thinking, although not to the point of a complete delusion, right? So they still have some connection with reality. That's what ideas and references mean. Kind of atypical beliefs and magical kinds of beliefs that aren't explained by differences in cultural influences. Again, some disruption in their perceptual experiences, so maybe not full-blown hallucination, but maybe something in that ballpark, right? It's kind of differences in sensation and perception experiences than the average person might have, different kinds of patterns of thinking and speech, any kind of paranoia or overly suspicious behavior. So you can see how these are related to some of the symptoms we talked about with schizophrenia, right? So constricted or inappropriate affect, so that's sort of getting at potential negative kinds of symptoms. Again, some of these are worded vaguely, but it would have to be to a point where it is basically causing discomfort in themselves. More often, it's causing discomfort in the lives of those around them, in a way. They're not very social, and they have excessive social anxiety. So you can see a variety of kinds of symptoms that are sort of attenuated versions of what you see in schizophrenia. And so, again, we all know people who exhibit some of these things. If they exhibit 5 or more, and then that would qualify them for the diagnosis from a clinical perspective. There is a questionnaire that is used in research literature that's designed to get at these kinds of symptoms. This would not be used diagnostically, so we wouldn't give someone this questionnaire and give them a diagnosis, right? Because that wouldn't have the depth of information you see with interviews.
Is there any information that suggests that people with this type of personality develop schizophrenia?
Yep, but my very next slide says it's genetically related, and it might be a mild or premorbid form of it. So, yep. So, there's pretty much widely accepted now that those who may show up with this type of personality disorder are at greater risk for developing schizophrenia later on. Yep. So this questionnaire, when you look at it from a psychometric perspective, right? So looking at how things sort of hold together statistically when you gather data from people, it separates into kind of 3 main domains of symptoms. So one is the cognitive perceptual kind of aspects. One is the interpersonal, right? So it's some of that social withdrawal or the difficulties interacting with others. And then one is sort of just disorganized, right? Being a little bit different or abnormal. So again, I want to make sure that I'm not saying that someone who is eccentric or just a little bit different, I'm not saying that they need criteria for this disorder. What I'm saying is if it reaches a certain point where you have a collection of many of these symptoms and it's actually starting to impact their ability to function, that's when it might approach diagnosis. But if you were to look into the research on this, you would probably see them using this questionnaire. And so, as I said, studies using genetics have looked to see and have shown that there is some genetic relationship. So even studies just as simple as looking to see if you have someone with schizophrenia, is there a higher rate of schizophrenia in their family members? And that is the case, but there's also a higher rate of this type of personality disorder. Some people speculate that it is sort of a premorbid form, meaning they may need criteria for this before going on to develop schizophrenia. The prevalence is much higher for this compared to schizophrenia, obviously. And we do see gender differences in the type of symptoms that tend to be more predominant when comparing men and women. Again, as far as I can tell, there's less research right now on people who don't identify in the binary. But for men, typically, they're more likely to exhibit more of the negative and disorganized symptoms, whereas women are more likely to exhibit social anxiety and odd or magical thinking symptoms. So one thing I want to point out, I'm going to go back to that questionnaire. In the interpersonal factor, some people have actually also split it into the things that are truly interpersonal, personal versus those that are more like social anxiety, right? People sometimes find me a little distant. I tend to keep on the background. So some of these are more social anxiety related versus others that are more about unable to get close to people, so poor social interaction skills, if that makes sense. And so you see that difference in terms of men versus women, where women tend to be particularly high on those more social anxiety type of symptoms. So when it comes to biological functioning, let's see the title. Since it is sometimes thought to be a precursor to schizophrenia, then you're probably not surprised that you see a lot of the same differences in brain structural deficits. Except, and again, there's not a huge literature on this, but it is growing. It looks like they don't show differences in the medial temporal lobes. They don't show that ventricular enlargement. And they might show hypoactivity of the frontal lobes, but what happens is when they have to engage in a task or measuring their frontal lobe activity, they tend to still do just as well as people without schizotypal or schizophrenia, but it looks like they have to activate a large proportion of brain areas to do it. Does that make sense? So that's what I mean when I say other areas may be included. So it's almost like they have to use more of their neural resources in order to perform as well as those without disorder. In addition, the handful of studies that have looked at this suggest they don't have those same dopamine abnormalities, so they don't have an overactive dopamine system, but they do have like the glutamate underactivity that we saw. So some people have questioned whether those abnormalities actually come first, and then as a result of those, that sort of spirals into or contributes to the dysfunction of the dopamine system. I don't have it on the slide, but I'll just mention that some of the other things we talked about, like reduced P300, you see that in the schizotypal as well. Medication treatments, like antipsychotic medications. Some studies have shown that that will reverse those ERP differences, so it might enhance their P300, for example. Some people will go the antidepressant route rather than antipsychotic, particularly if the social anxiety element is really high for them. Now, we didn't see, or I didn't talk a lot about psychotherapy for schizophrenia. Again, sometimes you do see that. But this is particularly important for personality disorders simply because it's a behavioral pattern with them. So you really have to sort of try to change the way that they think. So, and that's one of the main goals that you see with cognitive behavior therapy, for example. Now, of course, there are other types of therapy too that may be relevant. But I would say probably the most popular for this is some type of cognitive behavior therapy to try to kind of help them reframe things, to help improve social interactions, decrease the anxiety and so forth. And then social support is a big factor for anybody with a personality disorder. So we'll talk about other personality disorders later in the semester. But one of the challenges with personality disorders is that oftentimes the person experiences less distress and impairment, or I should say they perceive less, but the people around them often seem more distressed, right? Because again, it's kind of who the person is, and it can cause difficulties with their relationships. And so having people in your life that can actually provide you with support, so family members and so forth, friends, actually makes a big difference in outcomes for those with any kind of personality disorder. So I did come across a study, and I want to give you guys an example of. So there's a study that looked at a medication in schizotypal personality disorder that's different from the categories I have here. Onfacine. Okay. So this is a medication that's explored for schizotypal personality disorder. Sometimes it's also used in ADHD. It is it acts on the norepinephrine system, and so it is an agonist. It's an adrenergic agonist. So it's affecting norepinephrine, epinephrine, for example. And what it does is it enhances prefrontal cortex functioning. And when you administer this medication along with cognitive retraining that I talked about earlier, it seems to have been shown, again, this is one study, to have positive effects in those with schizotypal personality disorder. So I just wanted to mention it. You guys don't have to have that memorized, but I want you to recognize that there are certain medications that are approved for some of these disorders, and then there are off-label uses that some people are exploring to try to target specifically some of the symptoms, and that kind of lines up with that dimensional approach that we talked about. So targeting the cognitive aspect that seems to be causing the person impairment. And the idea for this is that maybe it will also prevent things from worsening and potentially moving into schizophrenia diagnosis. Does that make sense?
So you mentioned this is also used like for ADHD. Is that also off-label, or what's it originally?
I would have to look because I think it's actually a blood pressure medication. So I'm going to guess it's off-label for ADHD, but because I think it's actually originally a blood pressure medication. I was looking to see if I had any more notes on it, but I don't. Okay.
Yes. It's a high blood pressure medication.
Okay. Yeah. So again, we're just starting into our first, category of disorders, and so we're going to see more instances where off-label uses of different drugs have been applied to a lot of different psychiatric disorders. And so, one thing I could do is try to look in to see what are the main things that are approved for them. But the thing is, for schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, the list of approved drugs of antipsychotics is humongous, right? So again, I don't expect you to memorize this name, but what I want to point out is that there's a lot of different ways to get at specific aspects of the disorders. Questions on any of that for the psychotic disorders? So then we will just get a little bit of a head start, perhaps. So if you took abnormal psychology, most of this is going to sound familiar to you. Oftentimes we categorize depression and bipolar disorders under the same umbrella of mood disorders, because obviously they represent fluctuations in our mood. In the DSM-5, the depressive disorders and the bipolar disorders are now like separate chapters or categories. They used to be lumped together. And so, a mood disorder is basically an illness that affects the emotional way an individual perceives the world. Now, we all fluctuate in our mood, right? So, some days we're feeling more positive or negative than others. In order to meet criteria for a mood disorder diagnosis, it's going to depend on how many symptoms the person exhibits, the severity of them, and how long they last. And when we're talking about the point where somebody has a diagnosable condition that's considered a mood disorder, we're talking about two main fluctuations in mood: depression versus mania. These are opposite ends of the spectrum. And I just have a note here that there are a lot of different diagnoses that depend on the severity and the time course. So again, I'm assuming most of you remember this from the previous course. That's so long called abnormal psychology. So basically, if you have a set of symptoms that have occurred within a 2-week period, it might be criteria for major depression. But if those symptoms persist for a much longer amount of time, months, then that would qualify more for persistent depressive disorder. So we'll kind of see some of these different diagnoses. As I said, depressive episodes and mania or manic episodes are the main diagnostic indicators. I already mentioned that DSM-5 separates those two different categories. These are the diagnoses that are in the depressive disorder section. So major depression, you can have major depression with a single episode, or you can have what they call recurrent major depression, which is when you meet those criteria by experiencing more than one episode. persistent depressive disorder, what we used to call dysthymia. So this is when it lasts much longer. Disruptive mood regulation disorder is something where you kind of get fluctuations like bipolar disorder, but it's more about how the inability to regulate those negative moods actually impacts on your ability to function. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder is a diagnosis when somebody experiences extreme symptoms related to mood. Obviously, it's diagnosed in women or those with a uterus that experience the menstrual cycle. And then, like with the other category we saw, there's kind of a catch-all diagnosis as well. And then for the bipolar disorders, we see bipolar 1 and 2, and then cyclothymic. So cyclothymic is that longer period of time. People are experiencing the mood fluctuations for a longer extended period. And then there's also a diagnosis of each of these due to some other medical condition. So if you have dementia or Alzheimer's disease, you develop depression, then that might not qualify for a separate major depression diagnosis. It might be depression due to the dementia, for example. And then the other one is, of course, it is induced by a substance. So, can anybody tell me the difference between bipolar 1 and 2 in terms of the diagnosis?
Bipolar 1, they could have only had one manic episode. With bipolar 2, they have, it's like cyclic, where they go between manic and hypomanic episodes.
Right, so hypomania is more featured in the bipolar 2. Whereas bipolar 1 is when you experience manic episode. Also, for bipolar 1, just one thing to note, you don't have to have experienced a depressive episode to get the diagnosis. So if you meet criteria for a manic episode, then you can meet criteria for bipolar 1. For bipolar 2, you do have to meet criteria for depressive episode as well as a hypomania, at least. So those are just some slight distinctions that are related to the severity and occurrence of the symptoms. And so there definitely are people who look to see, are there differences then, right, from a biological perspective. All right, so we'll run through the criteria for major depressive disorder. Again, I'm assuming most of you are familiar with this. And just keep in mind that this is talking about experiencing 5 or more of these symptoms within a specified 2-week period. And this has to be a change to that person, right? So if they typically exhibit these symptoms on a regular basis consistently, then that's not a big enough of a change. And then they have to show at least depressed mood or loss of interest. So that's that anhedonia that we talked about before. So that is required. So they have to show at least one of these 2 symptoms. And then they can show changes in weight. They can show problems with sleep, some type of motor agitation, right? So psychomotor agitation might mean they're extra fidgety, or psychomotor retardation means they move a little slower. Fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day, feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt nearly every day, problems with concentration, focus, and of course suicidality. And then you can see that I've kind of labeled each of these as either an emotional symptom, a somatic symptom, or a cognitive symptom. And so there have been studies that have tried to hone in, again, kind of taking that dimensional perspective to see, are there differences that seem to be more related to the type of symptom that they're experiencing? Can we tailor treatment to the predominant type of symptom? Things like that. So those are the main criteria related to the symptoms. But in addition, the person, of course, has to have clinically significant distress. proper impairment. You have to rule out if the symptoms are caused by something else, like other drugs, or, for example, people with hypothyroidism often experience symptoms of depression. If it's due to the hypothyroidism, and once the person is on the proper thyroid medication, for example, then the symptoms may dissipate. So those criteria, so the symptoms on the first slide and then these two criterion, if someone meets those criteria, then that qualifies them for a depressive episode. In addition, though, you have to make sure that you rule out other potential diagnoses, and you have to rule out any kind of mania or hypomania. Otherwise, it would fall into the bipolar category, right? Okay, so there are slight variations in the criteria for diagnosing depression in children. So they don't always show what we call like a sad or blue state. Sometimes it shows up with them more in irritability. And then if somebody has like a death in their family, they can still get a criteria for diagnosis, but that should also be considered.
So on the last slide, there was that point like it can't be explained by any psychotic disorder or something. There's the diagnosis of like depression with psychotic features.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's actually on the next slide. Yeah. So we're not going to get into it today, but yeah. So and then we didn't talk about schizoaffective disorder, which is a different diagnosis that involves mood criteria and psychosis. So sometimes it can be a little tricky trying to determine which of these is most applicable. So yeah, there are a lot of specifiers for the depressive disorders, and we'll talk about each of those a little bit next time. The main idea is that if you were to treat one of those other symptoms and it caused the major depression to disappear, then clearly it's the other symptom, right? The other diagnosis. And so it's just to help clarify in terms of assessment. So, major depressive disorder has a high prevalence, which you're not that surprised about. It's higher in women. Particularly starts earlier in women. You can see it at age of onset is earlier in young adulthood, but it can happen earlier or it can happen later. And there's a lot of variability. The longer somebody goes without experiencing another episode, then the better the predicted outcome, if that makes sense. So, when we talk about the categorical approach to mental disorders, and we talk about like that heterogeneity within a diagnosis, major depression is definitely like a good representative example, because you can have people who exhibit completely different sets of symptoms, have a completely different course of the disorder, respond to very different treatments, but they're all getting that same link, right? And so this is one of those disorders where you really start seeing a push towards trying to better identify what the specific dimensions are that are kind of mechanisms that are underlying it, as opposed to just putting everybody into that category. So I think I'll stop there since we've only got like a minute left. But we'll get into the specifiers and the other diagnoses on Monday. Probably first we'll have a presentation, and then we'll continue with this. So have a good weekend. Let me know if you have questions on your reaction papers. I'll be checking them out.
Yes.
Sorry about the confusion before.
That's all right. I should have let you know. I thought most of the time I had